Subscribe to my YouTube channel for deeply emotional, romantic, and mature stories that echo through your heart. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support meaningful storytelling. Sarah had always believed that some lines were never meant to be crossed. At 42, she had learned to navigate life's complexities with careful precision, maintaining the delicate balance between friendship, propriety, and the unexpected storms that could shake even the most carefully constructed foundations. But on that particular October evening, as rain drummed against the windows of her cozy suburban home, she would discover that the heart rarely consults the mind before making its most profound decisions. The phone call came at 7:30, just as Sarah was settling into her favorite armchair with a cup of chamomile tea and the latest bestseller everyone at work had been discussing. Margaret's voice carried that familiar note of desperation that had become increasingly common over the past year. "Sarah, I know this is last minute, but could you possibly watch Daniel tonight? Richard's flight got delayed, and I have this work emergency that simply cannot wait until tomorrow." Margaret's words tumbled out in a rush, the way they always did when she was overwhelmed. Sarah glanced at the clock, then at the rain-soaked windows. Her evening plans consisted of nothing more ambitious than reading, and perhaps ordering takeout. "Of course, Maggie. I don't mind. How long will you be?" "Probably not until very late. Maybe midnight?" "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I know you value your quiet evenings." As Margaret's best friend of nearly 15 years, Sarah had watched Daniel grow from a gangly 13-year-old into the man he was today. At 25, he had returned from his master's program in architecture just 6 months ago, and the transformation had been remarkable. Gone was the awkward teenager who used to spill juice on her carpet and argue with his mother about video game privileges. In his place stood a man with thoughtful eyes, strong hands that sketched buildings with unconscious grace, and a quiet confidence that Sarah found herself noticing more often than she cared to admit. "It's no trouble at all," Sarah assured her friend, though something in her chest fluttered with an anticipation she chose not to examine too closely. "Send him over whenever you're ready to leave." 20 minutes later, Daniel stood on her doorstep, his dark hair damp from the rain, a small overnight bag slung over his shoulder. He wore a simple grey sweater that brought out the green in his eyes. And when he smiled, Sarah felt something shift in the carefully maintained order of her world. "I hope you don't mind the company," he said, stepping inside and shaking the rain from his jacket. "Mum's been running around like a woman possessed all day. I think she's more stressed about leaving me here than about whatever crisis is waiting at the office." Sarah laughed, closing the door behind him. "You're 25, Daniel. I think you can manage an evening without supervision." "Tell that to her," he said with a grin that was both boyish and devastatingly mature. "She still sees me as the kid who set the kitchen on fire trying to make pancakes." They settled into the living room, where Sarah had been reading. Daniel looked around appreciatively at the space she had spent years perfecting, the warm earth tones, the carefully curated books, the soft lighting that made everything feel intimate and welcoming. "I've always loved this room," he said, settling onto the couch. "It feels like you, somehow. Peaceful but interesting." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Would you like something to drink?" "I was just making tea, but I have coffee, or..." "Tea sounds perfect." As Sarah prepared the tea, she found herself moving with unusual awareness, conscious of Daniel's presence in ways that felt both natural and entirely inappropriate. She could hear him moving around the living room, probably examining her bookshelves, the way he always did. Daniel had been a voracious reader since childhood, and their conversations about literature had evolved over the years into something that felt more like intellectual companionship than the typical exchanges between family friend and child. When she returned with the tea, She found him holding her copy of The Time Traveler's Wife, his expression thoughtful. "I've been meaning to read this," he said, accepting the steaming mug. "Everyone says it's heartbreaking." "It is." Sarah settled into her chair, curling her legs beneath her. "But beautifully so. It's about love that transcends time, circumstances, all the things that usually tear people apart." Daniel set the book aside and looked at her directly. "Do you believe in that kind of love? The kind that defies logic?" The question caught her off guard. There was something in his tone, in the way he was looking at her, that made her pulse quicken. I suppose I'd like to, though I'm not sure I've ever experienced it myself." "That surprises me. Why?" "Because you're—" He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "You're the kind of person who deserves that kind of love. Deep, consuming, transformative. The kind that changes everything." Sarah felt her breath catch. The conversation had taken a turn that felt both thrilling and dangerous. "Daniel ... double quotes. I know what you're thinking," he said quietly. "But I'm not a child anymore, Sarah. I haven't been for a long time." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither seemed ready to fully acknowledge. Finally, Sarah stood, needing to break the intensity of the moment. "I thought we might watch a movie," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "Something light. A comedy, maybe." Daniel nodded, but his eyes never left her face. "Whatever you'd like." They ended up choosing an old romantic comedy from the 90s. Something Sarah had seen dozens of times, but knew would provide a safe, familiar backdrop for the evening. As the opening credits rolled, Daniel moved from the couch to the floor, leaning back against the coffee table in a way that brought him closer to Sarah's chair. "More comfortable?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. "Much." He turned to smile at her, and in the flickering light from the television, he looked older, more serious. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever think about the paths we don't take? The choices we make that close certain doors forever?" Sarah's heart began to race. "Sometimes." "Why?" "I've been thinking about that a lot lately. About the difference between what we want and what we think we should want. About the gap between desire and duty." On the screen, the romantic leads were meeting for the first time in a bookstore, their chemistry immediate and undeniable. Sarah found herself unable to focus on the familiar story, too aware of Daniel's presence, of the way the lamplight caught the strong line of his jaw, of the careful way he was choosing his words. "I think," she said carefully, "that we all have responsibilities. To ourselves, to others. Lines we shouldn't cross, even if crossing them might lead to something beautiful. Especially then." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his attention seemingly focused on the movie, but Sarah could sense the tension in his posture, the way his hands rested carefully on his knees, the controlled steadiness of his breathing. "When I was in graduate school," he said eventually, "I dated someone, Emma. She was brilliant, beautiful, everything I thought I wanted. But being with her felt like wearing clothes that almost fit, close enough that everyone else thought they looked fine. But I could always feel where they pulled wrong, where they didn't quite sit right." Sarah found herself leaning forward, slightly drawn into his story despite herself. "What happened?" "Nothing dramatic. We just faded." She realized it too, eventually, that we were trying to force something that wasn't there. He turned to look at her again, but it made me realize that I'd spent so long thinking about what I was supposed to want that I'd never really examined what I actually wanted. Not until I came home. The weight of his words settled over her like a blanket, warm and suffocating at once. Sarah felt as if she was standing at the edge of a cliff, the ground beneath her feet suddenly uncertain. "Daniel," she began, but he held up a hand gently. "I know what you're going to say. That I'm your best friend's son. That there's an age difference. That people would talk, would judge. That it would complicate everything." His voice was steady, mature, with none of the impulsiveness she might have expected. "But I also know that when I look at you, I see someone who understands me in ways that no one else ever has. Someone who challenges me intellectually, who makes me want to be better. Who what?" The words escaped before she could stop them. "Who makes me feel like I've been sleepwalking my whole life, and I'm finally waking up." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the careful walls she'd built around her heart beginning to crumble. "This is impossible, Daniel. You have to know that." "Why?" "Because of what other people might think. Because of some arbitrary rules about age and propriety." He shifted, moving closer to her chair. "Sarah, I've thought about this. I've examined it from every angle, questioned my own motives, considered all the complications. And the conclusion I keep reaching is that the only real impossibility would be pretending I don't feel this way." "Feel what way?" she whispered. "Like, I'm in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, irrevocable and transformative. Sarah felt her carefully constructed world shift on its axis, realigning itself around this new, impossible truth. "You can't be," she said, but even as she spoke, she knew it was denial rather than conviction. She had seen the way he looked at her, had felt the charge in their conversations, had recognized the careful distance he maintained as something other than mere respect. "I've been in love with you for 3 years, Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength. "Since I was 22 and came home for Christmas break to find you helping Mom with dinner. You were wearing that blue dress with the small flowers, and you were laughing at something Dad said. And I looked at you and thought, this is what love feels like. Not the desperate, grasping thing I'd experienced before, but something deeper. Something that felt like coming home." Sarah's breath caught. She remembered that Christmas, remembered the strange moment when she'd looked up to find Daniel watching her, with an expression she hadn't quite been able to interpret. She'd dismissed it then, told herself she was imagining things. "I was just Margaret's friend," she said weakly. "No," Daniel said firmly. "You were never just anything. You were the woman who recommended books that changed how I saw the world. The person who asked me real questions about my dreams and actually listened to the answers. The one who made me feel seen and understood in ways that no one else ever has." He moved closer, kneeling beside her chair, and Sarah found herself unable to look away from his face. In the soft light, he looked older than his years, his expression serious and intent. "I know this complicates everything," he continued. "I know there are 1,000 reasons why we shouldn't feel this way. But Sarah, I also know that what I feel for you is real. It's the most real thing I've ever experienced. And I hope, that maybe you feel something too." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. Everything logical in her mind screamed that this was wrong, inappropriate, impossible. But her heart, her treacherous heart, was singing a different song entirely. She began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the truth that was clawing its way up from depths she'd kept carefully buried. "Tell me," Daniel said softly. "Please, just tell me the truth." Sarah looked at him, at this man who had somehow transformed from Margaret's son into someone who made her feel things she'd thought were lost to her forever. She thought of all the evenings she'd found excuses to visit when she knew he'd be home, all the conversations that had lingered long past their natural endings, all the moments when she'd caught herself noticing the way his hands moved when he talked about his work or the way his eyes lit up when he smiled. I care about you, she said finally. More than I should. More than I ever intended to. How much more? The question was barely above a whisper, but it seemed to echo in the quiet room. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. The weight of her carefully guarded emotions finally too much to bear. Enough that it scares me, she admitted. Enough that I lie awake at night, thinking about things I shouldn't think about. Enough that when your mother mentions you dating someone, I feel something that looks an awful lot like jealousy. Daniel's eyes closed for a moment, as if her words were a relief he'd been waiting years to hear. When he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. Sarah, he said, reaching out to touch her hand. The contact sent electricity through her entire body. What are we going to do? I don't know, she whispered. I honestly don't know. They sat in silence for a long moment, hands connected, both of them breathing carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter the fragile honesty between them. On the television, the romantic comedy continued its predictable arc, but neither of them was paying attention anymore. Your mother, Sarah said eventually. She's my best friend. How could I? She wants you to be happy, Daniel said. She's always said that you deserve someone who sees how amazing you are. Not her son, maybe not. But maybe she'd understand better than you think. Maybe she'd see what I see, that this isn't some passing infatuation or midlife crisis. That it's something deeper. Sarah shook her head. The age difference alone, is 17 years. I know. I've done the math. But Sarah, you're 42, not 62. I'm 25, not 15. We're both adults. We both know our own minds. People will judge. Let them. His grip on her hand tightened. I've spent my whole life trying to meet other people's expectations. I chose architecture because it was practical. I dated Emma because she was the kind of girl everyone expected me to date. I've been so busy being who I thought I should be that I almost lost sight of who I actually am. And who are you? I'm a man who's in love with a woman who happens to be 17 years older than me and happens to be my mother's best friend. I'm someone who would rather face 1,000 complications than live without the possibility of being with you. Sarah felt her resolve wavering, the logical objections in her mind growing quieter in the face of the raw honesty in his voice. Daniel, even if this were possible, what would it look like? How would we ... I don't know, he admitted. I don't have all the answers. But I know that I'd rather figure it out with you than pretend this doesn't exist. The movie. Credits began to roll, filling the room with soft music that seemed to underscore the weight of their conversation. Sarah realized that everything had changed in the space of a few hours, that the comfortable boundaries of their relationship had dissolved entirely. I need time, she said finally, to think, to process all of this. Daniel nodded, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. Of course, I've had 3 years to think about this. You've had 3 hours. What if... Sarah hesitated, then forced herself to continue. What if I decide it's too complicated? Too risky? Then I'll respect that decision, Daniel said, though his voice was heavy with sadness. But I hope you'll really consider it. Not just the risks and complications, but the possibility that this could be something beautiful. Something worth fighting for. They heard the sound of a car in the driveway, headlights sweeping across the windows. Margaret was home. Daniel stood, quickly, smoothing his sweater and running a hand through his hair. Sarah rose too, her legs unsteady beneath her. How do we ... double quotes, she began. We act normal, Daniel said. We've been friends for years. We can do normal. But as Margaret's key turned in the lock, Both of them knew that normal was a luxury they'd lost somewhere between the beginning of the evening and this moment of reckoning. Sarah? Daniel? Margaret's voice called from the entryway. I'm home. In. Here, Mom. Daniel called back, his voice steady despite the emotional storm they'd just weathered. Margaret appeared in the doorway, looking tired but relieved. I'm so sorry it took so long. The presentation ran over, and then there were questions, and... She paused, looking between them. Is everything okay? You both look a little strange. Just tired, Sarah said quickly. Long day. We watched a movie, Daniel added. One of those romantic comedies from the 90s. Very emotional. Margaret laughed. Oh, those will get you every time. I can't watch When Harry Met Sally without crying buckets. She moved to kiss Daniel's cheek. Thank you for being patient with your neurotic mother. Always, Daniel said, hugging her briefly. His eyes met Sarah's over his mother's shoulder, and she saw in them a question, a hope, a promise of patience. I should go, Sarah said, suddenly needing to escape the charged atmosphere. Let you two catch up. Oh, don't leave on my account. Margaret protested. I'm just going to make some tea and collapse. You're welcome to stay. Thanks, but I have an early morning, Sarah lied. Daniel, it was lovely spending time with you. Likewise, he said, and the simple word carried the weight of everything they'd shared. As Sarah gathered her things, she was acutely aware of Daniel's presence, of the way he moved to help her with her coat, of the brief moment when their fingers touched as he handed her the keys she'd dropped. I'll walk you to your car, he said. That's sweet, but it's just across the driveway, Margaret called from the kitchen. Sarah, drive carefully. The roads are still wet. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and cool. Sarah's car was parked just 20 feet away, but the distance felt vast and significant. Sarah, Daniel said quietly, catching her hand as she reached for the door handle. She turned to face him, and in the dim light from the porch, he looked young and vulnerable and heartbreakingly hopeful. Whatever you decide, he said, I want you to know that tonight. This conversation, it's the most honest I've ever been with anyone. The most myself I've ever felt. Daniel. I love you, he said simply. Not as my mother's friend, not as some fantasy or infatuation, but as the woman you are. The brilliant, compassionate, complex woman who makes me want to be better than I am. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. Really think about it. About what we could be together. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Daniel leaned forward and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. A gesture that was both innocent and intimate. Good night, Sarah. Good night. She drove home through the quiet streets, her mind reeling with everything that had happened. In the space of a few hours, her entire world had been turned upside down. Daniel, Margaret's son, the boy she'd known since he was 13, was in love with her. And she, if she was being honest with herself, was in love with him too. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a strange combination of joy and panic. She thought of Daniel's words, of the way he'd looked at her, of the careful way he'd laid out his feelings without pressuring her for an immediate response. At home, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat in the same chair where she'd been reading just hours before. The book was still there, bookmarked at the same page, but she felt like a completely different person from the woman who had been reading it. She thought about Margaret, about their friendship, about the potential consequences of acting on what she felt. She thought about the age difference, about what people would say, about all the practical complications that would arise. But she also thought about Daniel's hands, about the way he'd looked at her when he said he loved her, about the possibility that this beautiful, impossible thing might actually be real. Her phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, her heart leaped, thinking it might be from Daniel. But it was from Margaret. "Thank you again for tonight. Daniel seemed so much more relaxed when I got home. You're good for him. He needs more people in his life who really see him for who he is." Sarah stared at the message for a long time, wondering if Margaret had any idea how prophetic her words were. She typed and deleted several responses before finally settling on a simple, "He's a wonderful young man. You should be proud." But as she prepared for bed, Sarah knew that sleep would be elusive. She had a decision to make, one that would affect not just her own life, but the lives of two people she cared about deeply. The question was whether she was brave enough to reach for something that might be extraordinary, or whether she would let fear keep her from the kind of love Daniel had described, the kind that defied logic, that transcended circumstances, that changed everything. As she lay in the darkness, Sarah realized that for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Terrified, confused, and completely uncertain about the future, but alive in a way she'd almost forgotten was possible. And in that realization, she began to understand that perhaps the real question wasn't whether she could afford to take this risk, but whether she could afford not to. Tomorrow, she would have to decide. But tonight, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to be loved by Daniel Martin. Completely, honestly, and without reservation. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, the future felt full of infinite, beautiful possibility. The rain began to fall again, drumming gently against her windows, and Sarah closed her eyes, carrying the memory of Daniel's words into her dreams. "I love you. Not as my mother's friend, not as some fantasy or infatuation, but as the woman you are. In the morning, everything would be different." But tonight she let herself believe that love might be enough to overcome any obstacle, to bridge any gap, to transform the impossible into something beautifully, inevitably real. The story of Sarah and Daniel had only just begun.